Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we're going to review how a quality functional deployment tool, or QFD, can be used to prioritize items such as project opportunities. There are no prerequisite lessons for this module, so we can jump right in. We'll begin by exploring what is a QFD and some of the key elements of a QFD.
Alright, QFD as an acronym basically stands for Quality Functional Deployment. I know that's a bit of a generic term, but basically it's also referred to as a house of quality, and it's a tool that helps objectively prioritize subjective items. How's that for a definition? Well, basically let's break that down a little bit more in a practical way. A QFD helps a team to prioritize lots of different items across just what they consider to be the most critical prioritization factors. Now, there are many ways that you could do a QFD. Sometimes they can get extremely complex, but what we're going to do, what I'm going to show you, is a real simple and common application of the QFD. There's a lot more details that you can get into in building a QFD, and actually there are those who can get certified in building a QFD. So granted, this is not at all going to that level of depth at all. This is going to be very high level, real simple, in a practical way, working with your team to help prioritize some of the critical items that they might want to work on, such as opportunities or projects. So this is just going to show you that level of the QFD. Alright, so the QFD also helps unify a team by resolving any potential conflicts that they might have. If they have competing initiatives or competing priorities between them, this is a great way to help resolve some of those conflicts. As well, it's a way for prioritizing projects that could be built by a team of experts, and we can do this QFD basically in a 2 to 4 hour meeting. Depending on the level of opportunities and projects that you need to be reviewed, this is something that can be done in just a short amount of time with your team, and there's a lot of value you can have by building this kind of tool with your team. So there are just a few elements with the QFD that I want to review, some basic elements, and I'm going to walk through a lot more details of this to get you a little bit familiar with it. First of all, there's a list of parameters. These are the items that need to be prioritized. So basically these can be the projects or customer requirements. It could be opportunities or tasks or duties or whatever it is. What are the items that you need to prioritize? That's what we're calling these list of parameters. The next item is a prioritization factors. In other words, how is it that we're going to determine what the priority is for these different things that we want to prioritize? So the factors are measurements basically that are most critical for the group that owns those parameters. So for whoever owns the projects or the requirements or opportunities, whatever it is you're prioritizing in your list of parameters, they're probably the best ones to define what are the prioritization factors that you're going to use. Some examples of prioritization factors could be like revenue or cost impact that is going to have on these different opportunities, or something that might help improve customer satisfaction, or the level of risk associated with each one, or maybe the timeliness, how long it would take to accomplish each opportunity or project that you're reviewing. And if you recall, some of these things like revenue or customer satisfaction, some of these might be familiar if you've looked at the CTQ drill down. So you can probably use the CTQ drill down as a good guide to identify what could be the ideal prioritization factors for your group if you already don't know what those should be. The third element that I want to review that you would use as part of the QFD would be impact scores. So basically, how is it that we can rank each parameter by each of those priorities? So the level basically of high, medium, or low, it's some sort of definition to determine the level of impact that the prioritization factor would have on the list of parameters. Again, I'm going to walk through some examples of what these might look like. So what does the overall process look like as we build a QFD? Again, like in an exercise with a team meeting over a 2 to 4 hour period. Well, I've broken it down to 5 basic steps you can follow through the team meeting to help you build this QFD with them. The first step basically is defining the list of parameters. Again, that's one of the first key elements identified here for QFD. After that, you would define the prioritization factors. The third is to rank the prioritization factors, and then fourth, we're going to score each of the parameters per factor, and the last step is basically to calculate and sort those parameters by score. So again, I'm going to walk you through several details of what this looks like, but basically what you have before you start this meeting, you're going to start with the list of parameters. That's something before you start this meeting, you want your team to define those. I'm going to give you some examples and details of that, but basically that's what you need before you even begin your meeting with them. Then the next 3 steps are basically the things that you're going to do during the meeting as you work together to define the prioritization factors and rank them and then score each parameter for each factor. There's inner 3 steps there. And then finally, the output that you want from the meeting is going to be that 5th step of when we calculate and sort the parameters for the scores that we give on the QFD tool itself.
Let's explore in more detail the process for building a QFD.
Alright, a QFD process begins with what we said was like an input to the meeting, and that's the first step of defining the list of parameters. These again are the items that you need to prioritize, whether they're the projects or opportunities or whatever it is that you're trying to prioritize. These are those list of items that you need to identify, and these should be informally collected prior to the meeting starts. That's why it's considered to be an input in here. It really should be done ahead of time, so you're starting your meeting with already having this list defined. Now, every team member really should try to make some contribution to adding some item to the list rather than just one person contributing everything, or even rather than having it all come from your sponsor or champion. It's best if you can let each person just make their own contribution to build that list. Now, for building that list, you should have a definition of every item that should be included. If the title of what it is isn't enough, then it should have some clarity to help define that. And there should be no item that's removed from the list once they've been added to the list. You can talk about removal later, maybe as you're building the QFD, but at least as you're gathering these up front, you should try to keep the list complete without removing anything ahead of time. The meeting itself should be scheduled as well ahead of time, and make sure you include all the team members, but it's ideal if you can not include more than 10 people. If you get too many people, it's too many, and it's going to take too long to actually accomplish the whole process of following the building of the QFD. So if you can, try to keep it to 10 people or less if possible. Now, the meeting itself may take 2 to 4 hours, as I mentioned earlier, and it really depends on the number of parameters that you're trying to define. So ideally, the list of parameters that you identify should be no more than 25. If you're getting more than that, it's probably going to be a much longer meeting, and maybe you're going to get into stuff that you really don't need to get into. So you should try to limit it to maybe 25 if possible. Alright, now that's all the input to the meeting. Let's get into next the actual meeting itself once it starts. I recommend always kicking off the meeting in the beginning, just spending a little bit of time kicking it off with your sponsor or champion to help set the stage for what you're trying to accomplish there and getting their buy-in as to why they're there and why this is so important to them. As well as part of the kickoff process, you should review those list of parameters to make sure everyone agrees that these are the parameters you're expecting to review, and allow for any clarification that might be necessary in case some folks don't understand what what the parameters were that were suggested before. Now, that second step that I identified was defining the prioritization factors themselves. This may take about 30 minutes to work through with your team, again, depending on the amount of folks that you have included in this exercise. Now, this process itself should involve the factors that would represent what's critical to the team. There really should not be more than 3 to 5 factors. I'm going to give you a couple examples of that in just a second. But really, you should make sure that you only identify no more than 5 factors, and at least 2 to 3 if possible. Now, you should also try to identify the thresholds you're going to use for defining what is high, medium, or low as a level of impact, again, as you work through the QFD exercise. So let me show you an example of what I mean on this. Here's a chart that's just showing a few examples of some that I've used in the past. Again, this can be a guide, but you might want to customize this to your specific need for the team and what priorities and prioritization factors you want to build for your team. So as an example, if you know that something that is a prioritization factor might be the financial impact. Let's say that you have a bunch of projects you're trying to review, and you know what determines how you're going to prioritize each project could be based off of the financial impact you expect from that particular project. So again, if you have 2 projects that you're comparing, which one gets the higher priority? If a financial impact of one is greater than another one, well, then that should be an ideal prioritization factor, the financial impact. So if it is, then that's something you should identify definitely here as a factor. Now, as identified as a factor itself, it doesn't matter whether the financial impact is revenue or expenses. The whole point is that it's making some sort of cash impact, some financial impact to the business. But what you should try to identify is how you want to determine what you consider to be low, medium, or high. In this example, we would say that, well, we said for low, something that we would call a low impact would be anything that's less than the $100,000 impact as a project. If something was anywhere from $100,000 to $1 million a year as a potential financial impact, whether that's adding additional revenue or reducing expenses, either way, we said, well, all right, for this particular team that we're working with, we'll call that a medium level impact. And then if anything was over $1 million, we would consider that a high level impact. For your group, you might want to use higher numbers depending on the level of impact that you tend to have financially, or you might find that you need to make the numbers much lower. It doesn't matter. As long as you identify what you want to call low, medium, or high, you establish those thresholds. That's really the critical thing here. And you just walk through that same type of thing for each of these other factors that you identify. Again, here's some other examples on customer satisfaction, or the timeliness for the project or opportunity that you're working, or the probability of success, which gets into kind of the risk. Do you really think this is something you can accomplish or not? Whatever factor you think you might use, again, as you're comparing one list of parameters, one of those items in the list of parameters to another, how are you comparing one to another, and what would cause one to have a higher priority than another? Those are the kinds of factors you want to identify in here. And when you identify them, again, you want to set those thresholds for low, medium, and high, and have them be a clear threshold so it's very specific of which level of low, medium, or high impact you would evaluate later as we work through the QFD exercise. All right, let's continue in this process, and we'll walk through now the third step, which is ranking the prioritization factors. This may take anywhere from about 10 to 20 minutes with your team as you work through these. So at this point, you should already have your prioritization factors defined. So now you want to do is rank those in order of importance. So you need to be able to work through those and identify what is the order of priority for each one. When you determine the order of priority, what you're going to use is actually the lowest number of one refers to the lowest ranking, and whatever is considered to be the highest ranking, then what should have the highest number. So again, if you have, for example, 5 different prioritization factors, you could rank them from 5 to 1, 5 being high, the top priority, 1 being the lowest priority. Now, if one or more of your factors are significantly more important than others, then it may be necessary that you have to weigh the ranking to account for that greater level of significance. In other words, again, let's say you have 5 factors that you're trying to evaluate. Well, you could rank them from 5 to 1 in the example I gave earlier. However, if, let's say, the top priority one is actually significantly more important, much more important than the other remaining prioritization factors, then it's perfectly okay if you want to give that top priority not just a 5 to show that it's as if it's 1 more greater than the number 4 beneath it. You might give it a much higher value, like a 7 or 10 or whatever you think might be representative of the additional weight you want to give that top priority. As well, the scale for ranking, you can have it in any level you want, from 5 to 1 or from 100 to 1. Like if you have 5 factors, you want to give the top one 100, and then you want to give the second level one a rank of 80, and then the next one 60, and then further down to 1, or whatever. It doesn't matter the actual numbers that you add on there. What is most important is that you rank them in the proper order, where again, the one that is the top ranking gets the highest number, and then whatever is the lowest ranking gets the lowest number. That's really going to be critical for the math that's a part of this Excel document where we're building this QFD tool. So let me give an example of how you'd build these, and in the tool template that I have available on the website for this QFD, there's a QFD1 definition tab, and that represents these items here as an example of what it might look like. And we've got a couple of prioritization factors on here, actually 3 of them that are listed. They're listed here as Y's here off to the left-hand side where it says prioritization factors. The items are the cost to finish, or the cost or risk if it's not done, or the time to research and do it. This is as if maybe you're doing a QFD exercise for home projects. So what are the projects themselves? Well, over on the far right-hand side, these are what we said was the first step, the list of parameters, the things you bring as an input into the meeting. This is where you would list all those items in the actual Excel document itself. And again, the second step we said was to identify the prioritization factors, and those are the ones listed on on the left-hand side. And then we also said was the third step was to rank those prioritization factors and the level of importance. So in this example, the one given the greatest level of importance, whatever is our top priority, is the cost to finish. The one that's the least important in this example is the one that has a 1 for importance, and that's the cost or risk if it's not done. Now if you notice a little bit to the right where it says notes, what's identified there are those thresholds that we talked about on the prior section, and that's basically how we're defining the low, medium, or high. This is not as critical. This is a little bit more free-form text. What is most critical are these 3 sections that I've got circled on here. This is really what's essential for inputting this information into the Excel document for when you want to calculate the QFD. Now we're going to continue our QFD process by looking into the 4th step, which is scoring each parameter per factor. Now this is going to take the bulk of your time. That's why we've allotted about 30 to 60 minutes. Again, this is where you can spend most of the time with your team working through this. Now on the tab where we were within Excel, when we had filled in all that information for the parameters and prioritization factors and ranked them, within that same tab there's a button that said Create QFD. Once we've got all those items populated through that prior step, you're going to click on that button and it will create a completely new tab with new information on it, similar to what is now showing here, and it's going to be in a new tab within Excel. Now what it takes is that information that was on that prior tab and it recreates this new tab with that same information and populates it. It's going to look like this, except it's not going to have any of the H's and L's and M's populated, and it's not going to have the numbers on there. But it will have all the other items that you had filled in. So if you notice across the top, it's got where this is home projects, so these are just examples, like if you're trying to build a QFD at home. These are the examples of maybe the different projects that you're going to work through. These were the list of parameter items that were identified in the first step as an input to this meeting. And then next on the left-hand side are the prioritization factors that we worked through, and just to the right of that where it says importance in the ranking of 3, 2, 1, it's going to sort for us the ranking we identified for those prioritization factors. So the goal of this exercise and working with your team at this particular step is to populate the H, L, and M values in these cells. So basically we're going to take each of these items and have the team discuss the level of impact from a prioritization factor perspective each of those factors have to the parameters. Now that sounds a little bit confusing, so let me explain it a little bit further, maybe using an example. So I'm going to move my mouse here just to demonstrate it on the screen. Let's say we're working through this first item here of replacing the roof shingles. So we would say for the team, all right, now the actual home project of trying to replace our roof shingles, because maybe there's a hole in the roof where we've got some damaged shingles or a little bit old, we want to replace them. So let's talk about that. What is the cost to actually finish that? Is it going to be a high level cost? Is it high level impact to our cost? Or is it going to be a medium or low? And again, this is where we refer to those thresholds we identified for high, medium, and low. And then we all come to agreement on that one. Then we move to the next one for the time to research on how to do it and to actually do it. Is that going to be a low amount of impact or a medium impact or a high impact? And then we move on to the last one, asking what's the cost or risk if we don't do it. If we skip this particular home project, if we don't get this replaced, then what's going to be the risk for not doing it? Well, it may cause additional damage to the roof, and if it rains and then there's leaks, it's going to create a whole lot more damage inside, so maybe they might decide the risk is high. So they might identify this as an H. The idea here is that behind the scenes, the document within Excel assigns a value for whether you're putting an H, an M, or an L in here. For an L, it's going to give it a value of 1. For an M, it's going to give it a value of 3. And for an H, it's going to give you a value of 9. It purposely defines it that way because the H's, we want it to stand out because we're giving it a high level impact. By doing that, it's going to calculate, for example, this value behind this H, we're saying it's a 9. Well, 9, it's going to multiply it by the level of importance. So 9 times 3 is 27. And then for this low, that we said was a value of 1, multiply that by the 2, then that's going to be 2. And then for the other H on here, that's again a value of 9, multiply it by the 1, and we're left with 9. So 27 plus 2 plus 9 is going to equal 38. And it's going to do that as you walk through this, each one of these projects or parameters with your team. It's going to calculate those values based off of whether you're defining as a high, medium, or low impact for each of these parameters based off of the prioritization factors. So the objective is, again, you want to populate as much of these high, medium, low impact levels as much as you can on this document. I find it a little bit easier myself. There's no perfect way to do this, but I find it easier to work through one parameter at a time, going through each column at a time, rather than going across a row at a time where you're changing parameters as you discuss one prioritization factor. I find it easier to go through one project, one opportunity, or one of these parameters at a time through the list of factors on the left-hand side. So I recommend also that as you work through this with your team and try to populate these, that you try to do it as quick as possible. Only allow maybe 10 to 30 seconds for scoring each item, or even less if possible, less time. That might sound pretty fast, but if you think about it, as you're building this, if you have 10 different parameters, that is like 10 different projects or opportunities that you're reviewing, and maybe you have 5 different prioritization factors, well, that means 10 times 5, you're going to have 50 different items in here, cells that you're going to have to populate with low, medium, or high. Well, if you spend 2 minutes on each one of those items, then for 50 different items times 2 minutes, that could take 100 minutes. We definitely don't want to spend that much time on this. You want to go as quickly as possible. One of the things I like to do as I work through this with the team is I try to help it move quickly by basically allowing somebody to shout out what they think the level of impact should be, high, medium, or low. And as I'm working through populating the document with them, I'll just track down whatever they say. I'll take the first answer that I hear. Rather than stopping to discuss every one, I'll take the first one. And if anyone disagrees, then they can stop and we can start to discuss it at that time. But usually it works really well if I just take the first answer somebody gives, somebody will give an answer, and generally everyone will agree, but if they do disagree, we'll stop and discuss it, and we can find ourselves moving through this a whole lot faster. So again, here's the example of what it looks like, and what we're again trying to do in this exercise in this fourth step is to score the high, medium, or low scoring in this middle section of this tab. All right, as we continue our QFD process, we're now going to create the output that we're going to get from this meeting, and that's where we calculate and sort the parameters by the scoring that we just gave it. Now this is going to take anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes for this exercise. So basically, when all the scoring is done, where you've built the tool with identifying the high, medium, and low level impact for each of those parameters against each of those prioritization factors, there's a button that says Sort QFD. You just click that button, and then it will take all of your values and resort them so that whatever is considered to be the top scoring, that is, whatever opportunity has the highest level of impact according to the prioritization factors that you've identified, whatever is the highest is going to be sorted onto the left-hand side, and then it's going to be listed off toward the right in descending order based off of the score that it calculated. And again, the scores that were calculated are, as I described earlier, where it's going to give a 1, 3, or 9 based off of whether you gave it a low, medium, or high value in that ranking. So when you do this, what I recommend is to review the results with the team and look at the order just to make sure that it makes sense to everyone. You want to make sure that everyone agrees. Now, it's okay if your team wants to change some of the scores. If they look at this and start scratching their heads and realize, you know what, I didn't expect this one to come out on top. Oh, you know what, I see why. It's because we gave this a high. But you know what? That's what we thought at first, but you know, now that we kind of gone through the exercise, maybe we should have given it a medium or a low. And it's okay if everyone agrees that they want to change something from a high to a medium or low to a high or whatever it is. It's perfectly fine if they want to change it. And sometimes it's valuable for them just to see the impact that it can have when you change the score. So go ahead, use the time to play around, and you want them to be in total agreement on whatever the values are. What might be surprising is that you might see that the values don't make that much of a difference at all. They might think they're making a difference by changing something from a low to a high or high to low. But if it's on a low prioritization factor, something that has a low ranking, it may not make a difference at all, and it may not shift the order. But if you do make some sort of change, just make sure that you click the Sort QFD button again, and it will then realign all those different parameters based off of the new values it just calculated. Once you've got that final agreement with your entire team, then I recommend that you bring that sponsor and champion back at the end of your meeting and you review everything with them, show them what you guys have built as a team, and to make sure that they agree with the results. Now, after you've done all this, you may be thinking, all right, what do we do with this information now? Well, here's where the rubber meets the road and where this really comes into adding a lot of value. And here's some options I can give you. Basically, if you have a list that is only about 5 to 10 parameters that you're reviewing, then what you can do is maybe assign a team member to each of those items, depending on the number of team members that you have, and have each of them explore each of those items now that you know the ranking and priority that each one of those parameters has. But if you find that you have a larger list, maybe over 10 items, if you recall I said try to keep it under 25. So if you find you've got at least 10 to 25, something like that, then I would look over the list of all those items and how they're prioritized based off of the scores, and see if you can find any logical breaks or gaps in the scoring. For example, if you have scoring that happens to be around 100, let's just say whatever the top ranking thing, the score ends up being somewhere near 100. You might find that some of the first few items that have the top score rank anywhere from about 100 to 80, and then you might see the next few drop to maybe 50 or 40 in their score. Well, that might be a logical break where you can see that there's some really big shift in the scoring between these top few items compared to the next level of scoring for the next items. So if you see that kind of thing, I would definitely pay attention to those and use that as a guide. Identify those top 3 or 5 items, the ones that seem to be near the top of the list and seem to be at a different scoring level than the other ones, and maybe just assign some of the folks one to each one of those top items, and have them explore, like doing a project pre-assessment or some sort of more in-depth evaluation, just to test the hypothesis of your team, to see if the financial savings are really there like maybe they expected, or maybe there's more involved and more complexity than what they originally thought that might actually affect the results from the QFD exercise itself. The point is, whatever you seem to find as the top priorities, go ahead and assign those to some of the team members so they can explore it and kind of test this out. But the value here is that rather than testing all of your parameters, you're putting your attention on those that you can now prove out with your team, that based off of their expertise, you're putting their attention on just those top few items instead. You're putting your energy where your team agrees it needs to be spent. So for the items that seem to be off to the right-hand side, where they're a lot lower in their scoring and everything, I would recommend not even digging into those at all. If it seems logically that you have a high level scoring for the top few items, put your attention there. And I wouldn't necessarily ignore all the other ones, but I would not spend a lot of time on those. Rather than just automatically thinking you're going to go to those once you finish the first top few items, instead what I recommend is focus on the top few items, and then after, maybe depending on the amount of time that you spend reviewing those, if it ends up being a few months that you spend on working those opportunities, then I would recommend, instead of moving your attention then to those next lower ranking items, you do this QFD exercise all over again. You reinstate those ones that had lower ranking, but you might find that you've got different parameters now, new things that you want to evaluate, new understanding that you need to consider. So it's worth spending, again, another 2 to 4 hour meeting working together with your team to rebuild this exercise. So you might find this QFD needs to be built periodically with your team. It really depends on how often those parameters change, but it could be a lot of value by keeping it fresh, keeping your team alive, and understanding what are the top priority items that they need to focus on, and that way you can also have the same confidence you're not putting your attention on the things that aren't a top priority, the things that don't have a high level impact to the business based off of the prioritization factors you identified.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, what I'd like you to ask yourself is, what competing projects or initiatives or opportunities do you see are in existence in your current functional area where you are? And based off of those items that you can identify, how are those items usually prioritized? What's the normal way your organization goes about prioritizing those kinds of things? Now, depending on how they do it, how would you prioritize them? And based off of the way that you would prioritize them, is it different than how your organization would prioritize them? And are there other people in your area that would agree with you in how you would prioritize them? Now, do these items, if they're competing projects and have competing priorities, do they need some formal prioritization? Like, is it worth going through all those items through a QFD exercise where you can build this QFD tool together and unify your team about what you really consider to be the top priority for your business area? Well, if you find that is true, then I recommend that you at least try to work through this exercise. Again, you're only talking about a 2 to 4 hour meeting possibly with your team. Let this be an opportunity to find your way in using this particular tool where you can see a lot of value in prioritizing the top items and then not trying to compete with the resources, compete with the leadership, and making sure that you're getting done what you need to get done because you know it adds the biggest value and has the top priority for your business.
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.